There is one situation, and it's actually pretty common, where if we use this skill of listening with empathy, it could actually result in a very toxic conversation. Hi everybody, this is Greg from Heart Tools, where we make it simple to build great relationships. And even though we've said that listening with empathy is the most critical skill to master if you want to build great relationships, there is one situation where if you utilize this skill, it could result in a toxic conversation. And that is when someone, instead of talking about their own struggles and their own problems, their own challenges, are talking about someone else's problems. And because the nature of listening with empathy is such that it invites people to continue talking, if you don't be careful, you could spend then 30 minutes talking about how controlling someone's boss is, or how irresponsible their 18-year-old son is, or how uncaring their spouse is. And what you've done is you've actually ended up gossiping about someone who really isn't there to defend themselves. And what that does when the person is not there to defend themselves is it creates a triangle, which is really unhealthy, where the person that we're talking about is the bad guy, and the person speaking is the victim to this bad guy, and I, as the listener, am kind of the rescuer. Now, hold on to that thought, because we're going to do a whole series on the triangle when we get to the section on protecting one another's power, because that triangle of bad guy, victim, rescuer does a lot to create really unhealthy one up, one down relationships. But for today, what we'll say is what happens then in that 30-minute conversation is the person you're listening to just gets stuck in that victim role. And because they've spent all this time talking about how, irresponsible their 18-year-old son is, and they haven't spent any time thinking about, what do I need to do to change the situation? What do I need to do to get my power back? How could I improve and grow in this situation, right? And the final thing that does in that kind of conversation is it actually erodes trust. Because if I'm willing to sit here and listen to you talk about, someone that we know for 30 minutes and how horrible they are, what are you going to go away thinking is going to happen the next time I talk to them, right? You're going to assume, well, the two of us are also going to talk about you behind your back. So it can really be a trust breaker in relationships. Now, let me say it is very natural, even if I want to talk about kind of what are my problems and struggles and challenges, to mention someone that I'm having a problem with as a reference point, as a jumping off point. I might say something like, boy, my mom just doesn't respect my boundaries when I try to say no. And then from there, I could either go onto a 30-minute discussion about how bad my mom is, or I could then start talking about how hard it is for me to say no, and how I need to get better at saying no, and how maybe I need to get a support system around me, and some of the reasons why it's hard to say no. So it can go in two directions. So my suggestion is that when someone mentions someone else's problems or struggles, to listen with empathy one time, right? And say something like, wow, sounds like that conversation you had with your mom on the phone was really frustrating for you, right? And then pay attention to where they go from there, right? And if where they go from there is, yeah, I've always had such a hard time saying no to people, and I get myself in a lot of trouble, and it wastes so much of my time, and I'm angry and tired, right? Then you can keep listening. But if it goes from there to another statement about how horrible their mother is, then you may need to redirect the conversation. And there are two simple steps that you can take in order to redirect a conversation so that it doesn't become this toxic gossip session. The first is to refer them back to the person they have a problem with and say, hey, if you have a problem with Jenny, maybe you ought to go talk to Jenny about that. I don't think I can help you resolve that problem. You need to talk to her about that, right? And a lot of times that's enough, and that's the only thing you have to do, and people get, oh yeah, you're right, I should go talk to her. Sometimes they'll want to continue talking. They may even say something like, hey, I just need to vent about this, or I need to blow off steam about this, which the problem with that is they're not blowing off steam. They're really blowing off like some toxic fumes that are poisoning your relationship with that person, your relationship with them, and their relationship with you, right? Everything gets really muddled if you do that. So the second step you can go to is what I do is I say something like, hey, I really have a high value that I don't talk about people negatively who aren't here. And I want you to know that if I ever have a problem with you, I'm going to come directly to you and talk about it. I don't want you to worry that I'm going to talk about you behind your back, but I also don't want to talk about this person behind their back. It makes me very uncomfortable. So those are the two steps that you can take in order to redirect a conversation from becoming toxic. Now, let me make one critical exception to this process, and that is if someone comes to you and tells you that someone is abusing them, or someone is bullying them, or someone is sexually harassing them, someone is traumatizing them, the last thing you want to do is redirect them back to the person traumatizing them. In this situation, they're not gossiping, and what we want in this situation is for the traumatized person to be protected and restored, and for the public to be put on guard against the person doing the traumatizing. We've all heard and read and been angered by stories of someone who has been allowed in the same family or in the same organization to go on abusing people for decades, and when it finally comes out, we hear there have been several times where someone has come forward and said, this person is abusing me. And instead of dealing with that, and instead of putting the public on guard against this person, the response is try to protect the family or protect the organization, protect the reputation. And so the person is maybe transferred to another department, transferred to another city where they can continue doing the same things. So that's one big exception to have in your mind, and it's important simply because if someone is being traumatized, if they're being bullied or abused or sexually harassed, and you send them back to the person traumatizing them and act like this is just kind of a common conflict management that they need to be involved with, they're just going to be re-traumatized again. But outside of that, if someone just wants to talk about someone else's problems rather than dealing with their own, redirect that conversation. First step is, hey, maybe, if you have a problem with our sister, you should talk to our sister instead of me. I can't fix that for you. And then the second step is, hey, I have a value. I don't talk about people behind their back. And I won't talk about you behind your back either. And see how that helps keep conversations healthy and keeps building trust with the people that you listen to. Simple steps. Practice, practice, practice. That's what Heart Tools is all about.